Douglas's fear did not announce itself with screams. It lived in the quiet margins of his days, in the way his small hands tightened without warning, in the way his eyes lingered too long on doorways and shadows. Night after night, his sleep fractured into restless fragments, dreams replaying images he could not fully name but could never escape. Sheila's face appeared again and again in those dreams, distorted and looming, sometimes smiling too softly, sometimes watching without blinking. When Douglas woke, he often could not remember what he had seen, only the feeling that followed him into daylight like a bruise no one else could see. During the day, that fear found another outlet. Douglas drew constantly, his crayons pressing hard into paper as if force alone could keep the images contained. The drawings unsettled Hope the first time she saw them. Crooked houses with no windows, figures with eyes scratched out, dark shapes looming behind smaller ones. At first, she told herself it was imagination, a child processing stories he had overheard or fears he did not yet understand. But the patterns persisted. The same symbols returned again and again, as if Douglas were circling a truth he could not articulate directly. Hope felt a growing unease, an instinctive certainty that these were not random expressions but fragments of memory struggling to surface. Liam noticed it too, the way Douglas flinched when certain names were spoken, the way his laughter sometimes stopped abruptly, as if he had wandered too close to a thought he was not ready to touch. Liam tried to reassure Hope, insisting they were giving fear too much power by naming it. Yet even he could not ignore the heaviness that settled over the house whenever Douglas fell silent. There was something unresolved there, something that refused to stay buried no matter how carefully they avoided it. The truth slipped out the way truths often do with children, without strategy, without awareness of consequence. One afternoon, while playing with his toys, Douglas began talking to himself in a low, careful voice, narrating a story that sounded like a game but felt anything but innocent. He mentioned a secret house, tucked away where no one was supposed to look. He spoke of a strange friend who waited there, someone Sheila told him not to talk about. The words were casual, almost sing-song, but they froze Hope in place. She felt the air leave her lungs as Liam looked up sharply, his attention snapping into focus. They did not interrupt Douglas immediately. They listened, every instinct screaming at them to stay still, to let him speak freely. Douglas did not elaborate much. He never did. He simply mentioned the house again, the friend again, as if these were facts already established, not secrets being revealed. When he finished playing, he moved on as if nothing significant had happened. Hope and Liam, however, were left staring at each other, the weight of what they had just heard settling heavily between them. Hope felt a surge of fear, followed quickly by resolve. This was not imagination. This was memory. Douglas had been holding on to something real, something dangerous, and it had finally surfaced. Liam shared her conclusion, his mind racing through the implications. If Sheila had a secret house, a hidden place she had trusted Douglas to know about, then she had not been as isolated or as cornered as everyone believed. Worse, the mention of a friend suggested she was not alone now. They contacted Steffi immediately, their voices tight with urgency as they repeated Douglas's words as precisely as they could remember them. Steffi did not hesitate. Her reaction was swift, decisive, sharpened by the same fear that had driven her for years. She contacted the police herself, insisting that Douglas's information be taken seriously. This was no longer speculation or paranoia. It was a lead, fragile but critical, offered by a child who had seen too much and understood too little. The investigation intensified almost overnight. Officers revisited old evidence, cross-referenced addresses, followed up on properties long dismissed as irrelevant. They questioned people who had once been considered peripheral, combing through connections Sheila might have maintained even while pretending to disappear. Douglas's words became the thread investigators pulled carefully, knowing that one wrong tug could snap it entirely. The idea of a hidden house reshaped their understanding of Sheila's movements, her resources, her capacity to plan beyond immediate survival. As the net tightened, Sheila felt the pressure immediately. She had always possessed an uncanny sensitivity to danger, an instinct honed through years of evasion. She sensed the shift before anyone told her outright, felt it in the sudden stillness of places that once felt safe, in the silence of phones that used to ring when she needed reassurance. Douglas's slip had changed everything. The past she thought she had locked away was clawing its way back into the present, threatening to expose not just her location but the careful architecture of lies she had built to survive. Sheila's fear was not explosive. It was cold, focused, and strategic. She understood that the greatest risk was not being found, but being found with someone else. If the police discovered she was protecting another person, hiding them deliberately, the narrative would shift irrevocably. She would no longer be a fugitive acting alone, but the center of a conspiracy. That realization forced her to make immediate adjustments. She abandoned routines, erased patterns, and prepared contingency plans she had hoped never to use. The question of who she was hiding haunted everyone involved. The name Luna surfaced quietly at first, spoken in hushed speculation rather than accusation. Luna's recent disappearance, her vague explanations, the inconsistencies that once seemed harmless now took on a darker significance. Could Sheila have taken her in? Could Luna, young and vulnerable, have become entangled in Sheila's web of manipulation? The possibility sent a chill through those who considered it, because it suggested not just survival but recruitment. Deacon felt the tension tearing him apart long before anyone demanded answers. He lived in a constant state of contradiction, pulled between loyalty and fear, guilt and responsibility. He knew Sheila's capacity for destruction better than most, yet he could not erase the version of her that had confided in him, that had relied on him when no one else would. At the same time, the thought of Hope and Douglas being endangered because of his silence was unbearable. Every choice felt like betrayal, no matter which direction he leaned. Finn and Steffi's pressure was relentless, driven by fear sharpened into anger. They confronted Deacon directly, demanding clarity where he offered only hesitation. To them, his indecision was complicity. They reminded him of what was at stake, of the children who could not protect themselves, of the damage already done by underestimating Sheila once too often. Deacon listened, absorbing their words like blows, knowing they were right, and still unable to let go of the woman who had woven herself so deeply into his sense of responsibility. The tension reached a breaking point when Sheila made a call she never intended to be traced. It was brief, coded, heavy with implication. She spoke of movement, of changing plans, of the risk becoming unavoidable. The voice on the other end was calm, unfamiliar, and disturbingly prepared. It was the voice of someone who had anticipated this moment, who had resources and options ready. When the call ended, Sheila felt a grim sense of relief. She was not alone anymore. But alliances, she knew, always came with a price. As police activity intensified, Deacon found himself standing at the edge of a decision that would define him irrevocably. Protecting Sheila meant lying, obstructing, and possibly condemning Hope and Douglas to continued fear. Turning against Sheila meant severing a bond forged in shared isolation, abandoning someone he believed still capable of redemption. The weight of that choice pressed down on him relentlessly, robbing him of sleep and peace. He began to understand that neutrality was no longer an option. Silence itself had become a form of action. Douglas, unaware of the chaos his words had unleashed, continued to struggle with his fear. The nightmares did not stop. If anything, they intensified, as if some part of him sensed the world shifting in response to something he had revealed. Hope stayed close to him, her protectiveness sharpening into something fierce and unyielding. She watched every shadow, questioned every sound, determined that whatever Sheila was hiding, whatever danger lingered, it would not reach her son again. The investigation closed in, guided by a child's fragmented memories and the relentless persistence of those who refused to dismiss them. Sheila, feeling the walls narrow, prepared for her boldest move yet. Whether she was hiding Luna or someone even more dangerous remained unclear, but one thing was certain: she would not go quietly. Survival had always been her art, and desperation her most powerful muse. As alliances shifted and secrets threatened to surface, everyone involved stood on the brink of irreversible change. Hope and Liam faced the terrifying reality that Douglas's innocence had already been compromised by forces far beyond his control. Steffi and Finn prepared for confrontation, determined not to let fear dictate their response again. Deacon hovered between past and future, knowing that whichever side he chose would cost him something he could never reclaim. And somewhere in the shadows, Sheila listened to the world closing in, her mind already racing toward the next escape, the next manipulation, the next sacrifice. The secret house, the strange friend, the whispered call, they were all pieces of a larger design, one that had not yet fully revealed itself. The question was no longer whether Sheila would be found, but what would be uncovered when she was. And whether the truth, once exposed, would finally end her reign of terror, or ignite something even more dangerous in its wake. The days that followed unfolded with a suffocating slowness, as if time itself had thickened under the weight of what was coming. No one involved felt untouched by the revelation Douglas had innocently released into the world. The child's words had acted like a fault line, splitting the fragile calm that had settled after Sheila's presumed disappearance, exposing how little safety truly existed beneath the surface. Every hour that passed without resolution deepened the sense that something far more dangerous than a fugitive was moving quietly through their lives, adapting, recalibrating, waiting. Douglas's nightmares worsened before anyone noticed the pattern. He no longer screamed when he woke. Instead, he sat up in bed, eyes wide, breathing shallow, as though he were listening for footsteps only he could hear. Hope learned to recognize the sound of his fear even in silence. She would find him tracing shapes on his blanket with shaking fingers, whispering fragments of stories that made no sense in isolation but carried a consistent emotional weight. The secret house appeared again and again, always drawn without windows, always surrounded by dark lines that pressed inward. Sometimes there was a second figure beside Sheila, taller, faceless, sketched with harsher strokes. Douglas never named that figure. He didn't have to. The presence alone was enough to make Hope's stomach twist. Liam watched all of this with a growing sense of helpless rage. He hated that Douglas's courage, because that was what it was, even if unintentional, had not brought immediate safety. Instead, it had summoned uncertainty, police interviews, whispered conversations behind closed doors. Liam understood the necessity of the investigation, but he resented the cost. Every question Douglas answered felt like another burden placed on shoulders already bent by fear. Liam found himself reliving his own failures, wondering how many warnings they had missed, how many signs they had dismissed because acknowledging them would have meant admitting that Sheila was never truly gone. Steffi refused to allow that luxury. For her, the past had always proven one thing with brutal consistency: hesitation gave Sheila power. She worked closely with the police, pushing them to treat Douglas's information not as a vague memory, but as actionable intelligence. She insisted on urgency, on visible progress, on leaving no corner unexamined simply because it made people uncomfortable. Finn supported her, though the strain showed in his eyes. As a doctor, he understood trauma intimately. As a father, he understood the instinct to protect at any cost. Watching Douglas unravel reopened wounds Finn had never fully healed, reminding him how close his own family had come to destruction. The police response intensified accordingly. Surveillance widened. Old informants were contacted. Properties linked to Sheila's past were quietly monitored. The mention of a friend shifted the investigation's tone entirely. It reframed Sheila not as a lone threat, but as a potential node in a larger network of influence and manipulation. That possibility unsettled even seasoned investigators. Sheila Carter alone was dangerous enough. Sheila Carter with an accomplice, especially a younger, more mobile one, was something else entirely. Speculation about Luna grew harder to ignore. Her sudden absence, her vague explanations, her emotional volatility in the weeks before disappearing, All of it took on a sinister coherence under the new lens. Police began asking questions, carefully at first, then more pointedly. Friends were contacted. Digital trails were examined. The conclusion forming quietly in investigative minds was not yet solid enough to announce, but it was deeply troubling. If Luna had indeed fallen under Sheila's influence, she was not just being hidden. She was being shaped. Sheila, for her part, felt the world tightening with an almost physical pressure. She moved through spaces that once felt familiar as if they were suddenly hostile, every sound magnified, every shadow suspect. She knew this phase well, the moment when the past resurfaces with teeth, when the careful balance between invisibility and control collapses. Douglas's words had been the spark, but the fire now threatened to consume far more than she had planned. The person she was hiding, however, was not merely a passive passenger in this ordeal. Luna sat in the dim light of the house Sheila had once described as temporary, listening to the radio crackle softly with news updates that never mentioned her name but always felt dangerously close. She had arrived here believing she was choosing refuge, believing Sheila's version of events in which the world was unfair, cruel, and determined to punish women who dared to survive. At first, Sheila's protection had felt intoxicating. Sheila listened. Sheila validated. Sheila framed Luna's mistakes not as failures, but as consequences of other people's cruelty. For someone already carrying guilt and confusion, that narrative had been irresistible. But as days passed, the tone shifted. Sheila became more controlling, more insistent. The rules multiplied. Windows stayed covered. Phones stayed off. Questions went unanswered. Luna began to sense that she was no longer being protected. She was being positioned. Sheila spoke of loyalty with increasing urgency, of sacrifices that might be required, of how the world would never forgive them if they did not stand together. The language felt familiar, rehearsed, heavy with implication. Luna realized, slowly and with growing dread, that she had stepped into a story that was not hers, one that had been written long before she arrived. Sheila's secret phone call had been part reassurance, part contingency. The voice on the other end belonged to someone who understood the cost of survival, someone who trafficked in disappearances and reinvention. The plan offered was bold, bordering on reckless, a clean break, new identities, a final vanishing act that would require absolute commitment. It was not an escape for one person. It was an escape for two. When Sheila presented this option to Luna, she framed it as salvation, as the only path forward that did not end in prison or disgrace. Luna hesitated. For the first time since she had followed Sheila into hiding, she questioned whether loyalty was worth erasing herself entirely. She thought of the life she had left behind, the people who would wonder where she went, the version of herself that had existed before fear became her constant companion. The realization that she was being asked to disappear not because she had no other choice, but because Sheila needed her to, sparked a quiet rebellion inside her. While Sheila and Luna navigated this fragile standoff, Deacon's crisis reached its breaking point. The pressure from Finn and Steffi intensified, shifting from accusation to ultimatum. They no longer asked Deacon what he knew. They told him what would happen if he continued to protect Sheila. They spoke of restraining orders, of custody concerns, of futures that would be irrevocably damaged by association alone. Deacon listened, torn between anger and shame. He wanted to argue that Sheila was more than the monster they described, that there were complexities no one wanted to acknowledge. But every time he imagined Douglas's haunted eyes, every time he pictured Hope's fear hardening into resolve, his defenses crumbled. Deacon began to understand something he had resisted for years. Loving someone did not absolve him of responsibility for the harm they caused. Protecting Sheila now meant participating in a lie that endangered children, that re-traumatized families, that perpetuated the cycle he had sworn he wanted to break. The realization did not come with clarity or relief. It came with grief. Sheila had represented a version of himself that believed in redemption without consequence. Letting go of that belief felt like losing a part of his own identity. The decisive moment arrived quietly. Deacon received a message he knew was meant to be comforting but landed as a warning. Sheila spoke of plans changing, of needing time, of trusting her as she had always trusted him. The subtext was unmistakable. She was asking him to choose her again, to align himself with whatever came next without question. For the first time, Deacon did not respond immediately. That silence became his answer. He went to Steffi and Finn not with a dramatic confession, but with exhaustion etched into every word. He admitted what he knew, what he suspected, and what he feared. He did not minimize Sheila's danger or exaggerate his own innocence. He simply told the truth as fully as he could, knowing that once spoken, it could not be reclaimed. The relief he felt was fleeting, quickly replaced by dread. Turning against Sheila did not make him safe. It made him exposed. The information Deacon provided shifted the investigation decisively. Police triangulated locations, cross-referenced movements, and identified a property that matched Douglas's fragmented descriptions with unsettling accuracy. The secret house was no longer a metaphor. It was real, tucked away just far enough to avoid attention, close enough to allow Sheila to maintain threads to her old life. As officers prepared to move, tension rippled outward. Hope sensed it immediately, the way people around her spoke more carefully, the way Liam refused to let Douglas out of his sight. She braced herself for whatever came next, knowing that resolution rarely arrived cleanly where Sheila was concerned. Douglas, sensing the shift, became quieter still. His drawing stopped. The blank pages frightened Hope more than the dark images ever had. When police finally approached the house, they did so with caution honed by years of dealing with Sheila Carter. What they found was not what they expected. Sheila was gone. The house bore signs of haste. Items left behind, plans half abandoned, but no Sheila. Luna, however, remained. Shaken, exhausted, and visibly conflicted, she told investigators everything. She spoke of manipulation disguised as care, of loyalty demanded under the threat of abandonment, of a woman who framed control as protection until it was almost too late to see the difference. Luna's testimony confirmed what many had feared. Sheila had been preparing to vanish again, taking Luna with her if she could, discarding her if she could not. The revelation sent shockwaves through everyone involved. Sheila's escape reignited fear, but Luna's survival offered something unexpected: clarity. For the first time, the narrative was not dominated by Sheila's voice. Someone else had spoken from inside her world and lived to tell the story. Deacon absorbed the news with a complex mix of relief and despair. Sheila was gone, but not defeated. He knew better than anyone that disappearance was not the same as defeat for her. Still, the knowledge that Luna had been saved, that Douglas's truth had mattered, offered a fragile sense of purpose. He had chosen a side, and while the consequences would follow him for the rest of his life, he could live with that choice. Douglas, slowly, began to sleep again. Not peacefully, not yet, but without waking every night in terror. The adults around him understood that healing would be a long road, one that required patience rather than certainty. Hope stayed close, anchoring him in routines that felt safe, in conversations that did not demand answers he was not ready to give. Somewhere, beyond reach and sight, Sheila listened to the world recalibrate without her. She had escaped, but the cost was higher than she had anticipated. The child who once trusted her had spoken. The man who once protected her had turned away. The young woman she tried to claim had chosen herself instead. For the first time, Sheila felt something unfamiliar gnaw at her certainty. She was alone again. And as the investigation continued, one truth became impossible to ignore. Sheila Carter was still out there, but the silence surrounding her no longer belonged to her alone. Others now carried the story. Others controlled the narrative. Whether that would finally end her reign of fear, or provoke her most dangerous return yet, remained to be seen.